discussing an academic paper that was published in the Journal of Political Economy. The title is The Origin of the State, Land Productivity or Appropriability by Omer Moav and others. Shout out to Econ Talk, the podcast. I came across this paper on that particular podcast. So here's the discussion. So this paper asks the question, why did states emerge? Why did this idea of organization and taxation actually emerge? And Omer defines a state as an organized elite that has the ability to levy taxes on others and then do something with it, either use it for their own purposes or for public goods, like in the modern times. So interesting paper from several perspectives. First, it forces you to think about, okay, what is a state? What is taxing? What does all that mean? Second, it also asks really important questions, and I'm gonna get to the point of why this is relevant for this particular podcast series and why we're talking about this in the first place. But it's relevant, and like most things in economics, the question is often the more interesting part of the analysis. And then the actual analysis, you can argue about the way they do it and all that. But I think third, I want to mention, which is the reason I'm doing this podcast, which is very interesting, and the following. Like in this particular paper, I think Omer and his collaborators, they make a fundamental mistake that often is made in economics, which is they get confused with causality, because their main argument is that states emerged because people started planting cereal versus other stuff. And when you plant cereal, you have to harvest once a year, and then you have to store the stuff. So you need protection. And that's why the state emerged, because when you were forced to store things, the state was able to tax you. So his argumentation is that depending on what you actually do from an economic activity perspective, the state can either tax you or not tax you. And if the state can tax you, well, they will tax you. And if you take a very simple thought experiment where you have a primitive tribe that is growing, let's say, guava or roots like that, which are very difficult to tax because you can leave them in the ground and only harvest them when you want to eat them. So you kind of have a just-in-time production here. That's harder to tax than cereal, which are not just-in-time. So that's his argument. And I'm paraphrasing the paper. We challenged the conventional productivity theory, contending that it was not an increase in food production that led to complex hierarchies in states, but rather the transition to reliance on appropriable cereal grains that facilitate taxation by the emerging elite. So that's the key sentence in the paper. I want to discuss this within the context of these 3 points. Like I said, number one, I want to talk about what is a state and what's the purpose and so on and so forth. Number two, I want to ask the question, why did the state emerge, and also, is it useful? So those two questions are related. And third, I want to talk about the causality and maybe also give my thoughts to the actual answer to the question. So this is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's March 8, 2023. This is Krim Delko. For the day, the fund is down 6.2%. The market's down 20 basis points. For the year, we are up 47.4%. The market is up 3.7%. We're outperforming by 43.7%. Today's underperformance is driven by Tesla, and quite frankly, I don't know what the news is other than some Twitter noise by Musk, but he was at the Morgan Stanley Technology Conference yesterday giving a presentation. Maybe he had some interviews, maybe some people picked up something that they didn't like or something along those lines. But what's happening with Tesla in the last couple of days, it's sort of the aftermath of the Investor Day that is leaving some questions open and opening also some real nice opportunities. We spoke about the Investor Day at length. We, written an essay about it, and also have a pretty long podcast episode about it. So I don't want to dwell too much here, but we're very positive, and we're also incredibly positive about the macro as far as Tesla is concerned, just because we believe that Tesla is very well positioned to go through this deflationary pressure that we're going to have in the next couple of quarters. So having said that, let's get to the paper. And just for new listeners, why are we even talking about economic papers here and so on and so forth? The Not Even Wrong podcast is the purpose of the podcast series is to give people a sense for what it feels like to run a hedge fund. And we discuss books here. We just discussed a recent book that we read next year in Havana, and very, very nice book. And we do that every now and then. So we have this podcast series is really about the hedge fund business. And the hedge fund business is a very versatile business where sometimes you have your pulse very, very close to the actual action. You go to companies, you visit factories, you listen, you look at quarterly sales data, monthly sales data, and you analyze your investments from that perspective. And then sometimes it's a more sort of backseat, big picture look at the world by which you have to formulate your thesis on the big picture front. So we read books for that. We said that reading in general is conditioning of the mind, and therefore very important, and not just a pastime that we recommend for fund managers, but actually it is part of the business. Now, academic papers are another avenue of inspiration and reading. It's just another story, in fact, that you're reading. And like we said also several times in the podcast, we're not too concerned about the genre. So am I reading a biography or a novel or an academic paper? Doesn't really matter that much. What matters is the story and the ideas that come with it. And ideas are the oxygen of capitalism. Ideas are the oxygen of progress, and we breathe that oxygen as much as the entrepreneurs that we invest in. So this paper raises a very interesting question. What is the origin of the state? Why did people way back, and I don't know the exact history, but let's go way back, okay? So we have this humanoid people in the savannah of Africa growing to some sort of hunter-gatherer existence that allows them to, keep living the way they live, like nomads. They move from place to place because the food is there, but also by moving around, they're less vulnerable to attacks. And then at some point, people decide to build, to do agriculture, which is the first big economic revolution, the agricultural revolution. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is agriculture actually? What does that even mean? Well, agriculture is just another way to do organized farming, or organized food production. So what organized means is you're not just at the whim of nature and luck and finding stuff. You predict that there will be something growing somewhere, and you can harvest that and eat. So it's a better way to provide for food. Later on, we meaning the human race, decides to cultivate animals. I mean, why go hunt animals? How about we catch them, put them in cages or in fenced areas, and have them breed and eat them? Like, isn't that easier? Isn't that less energetically expensive? So this is, if you want physics analogy, it's a lower energy state. It's less entropy, and it requires energy, of course, to decrease entropy. But then you get to a lower energy state, which is desirable. So it's I don't know if that's actually physically possible. Maybe I'm just talking gibberish here, and I apologize for this physics analogy. But I like to read a lot of physics, and I see a lot of nice analogies. So what I'm saying here is, and I've said that before, that in order to create progress is a decrease in entropy. Okay, so if we don't, if we just let things go, if we let the universe keep going on its way, we will not get to rockets and Teslas and agriculture and iPhones and all that nice stuff that we have. We need to apply energy to organize ourselves and bridge certain gaps, meaning we have to do things that are maybe a bit inconvenient, like things like we have to get degrees in mechanical engineering and study and do experiments and do kind of painful stuff, but then we figure out stuff through that process, and that allows us to increase our standard of living because we can lower the total cost of ownership while increasing the value that we get from products and services. And that requires energy. And all of this is just meant to illustrate that the same problem has always been around in humans, which is how do we organize ourselves in a way that makes our lives better. And this is already my key critique to the paper, because the paper says that states and taxation arose because people chose to plant certain cereals versus others. Now let me just real quick define the state. Omer defines the state as an elite that has the monopoly on taxation and or violence. Usually these things go in line together. So basically, if I have the monopoly on violence, you're at the whim of my desire to tax you. And what Omer is saying is the reason I organize myself that way as a society is because I can tax you. Because if I can't tax you, then what's the point, right? And that's a valid reason. And he's using, I think, guava or cassava, some root that grows in areas around the world versus cereal. And the difference is the root is the kind of food that is in the ground and can be harvested and then eaten, has to be eaten right away, cannot be stored. But as long as it's in the ground, it can stay there for a long time. In other words, you can do just-in-time production, versus cereals are not just-in-time production. Now you can ask yourself, well, why do cereals versus guava? And my guess is, and I haven't read that in the paper, maybe he's mentioning it somewhere, or it doesn't matter, but my point is, the question, of course, arises, well, why cereal versus roots? I believe you have more flexibility, probably more protein per square foot, and you can support more people and all that stuff. But my main argument against this type of thinking is that, well, what about causality here? Well, maybe it took us first to rethink the way we organize ourselves. In other words, how about we invent the state first, and then we start planting more appropriate cereals? So how about we sit down and think, hey, listen, how about instead of being nomads, or instead of just growing guava or whatever, cassava, roots, we want to increase the flexibility of our diet. But in order to do that, we have to store things. And later on, when we invent the animal agriculture and all that, we have to, we have animals in fences. We're vulnerable. And the rise of feudalism, which is something I got from the Hardcore History podcast, when you listen to, let's say, Dan Carlin talking about the Persian Wars and the Babylonians and Mesopotamia and all that stuff, which is related to this paper, because that's kind of when all this started, this organized taxing, big elite state type stuff. When that started, people were, there was this feudalist tendency. So let's say the emperor of Persia would take over land and then put lords in place and give people protection. Tell them most of the time, at least that's how Dan Carlin puts it, it doesn't really matter who's the overlord here. As long as somebody protects me, lets me do my daily work, and gives me a reasonable amount of taxation against that, I think I'm fine. And I think what happened during history over and over again is that these things start often in some sort of benevolent way. It's not that bad, but then it just gets worse and worse. And this is something I'm going to put later in the conclusion, because it relates to today and the question of where we're heading as a state today. But before we get there, let's just finish the argument. So my point is that it took, basically, it took human ingenuity. It took somebody to sit down and think about, hey, how should we organize ourselves in order to come up with the concept of a state? And then the state enabled lots of good things. So it's not very clear that this whole thing was driven by nature and technology. Maybe it was the other way around. That's my point. And I think that's really very important. That's why this is now, I'm drawing the arch to today. The way we think about investing, the way we think about our portfolio is, yeah, it's driven by technology, it's driven by the infrastructure and the institutions around us, but it's mainly the people. It's 0 to 1. It's the actual entrepreneurs and the group of people that invests their capital, the human capital, their money and their time into building something. That is what drives progress. On a different tangent, there's a line in Godfather 2 when the Al Pacino character, Michael Corleone, is in Cuba and he just witnesses some rebels being chased by the Batista soldiers. This is just shortly before the revolution happens. And in the movie that they're actually there when the revolution happens. And then Michael Corleone says something to Hyman Roth, his partner, who is supposed to build casinos in Havana. He says, the Batista soldiers, they are paid to fight. The rebels are not. And the rebels fight a lot more passionate. How's this going to pan out? And then, anyway, the movie goes on. And it made me think, if I look at Tesla employees, yeah, of course they're paid to work, but they're passionate. And they're not paid to be passionate. And Ford and GM and Volkswagen people are not passionate. BYD people are not passionate. So there's something about putting ideas in people's minds that changes the way they work. And this, now back to the paper, I would say the origin of the state is as much human ingenuity and the idea to maybe change the way we organize ourselves. Okay, we're a tribe, we live along the Nile River, and we go up and down and we fight the lions and we fight the other tribes. How about some of the elders sit down and say, how about this part of the river? How about we create something, let's not call it the state, but some little enclave, where we protect each other, where we put our sons in charge, we call them soldiers or something, and they protect all the families, not just my family. And we give them food. And we give them maybe also our prettiest daughters as wives. And then that thing turns out to be pretty successful. So how about we connect even more of that? The other enclaves, the other tribes come, hey, can we join you guys? Yeah, you can, but we want your oldest son to be a soldier and the prettiest girl is going to be married to one of the other soldiers. Yeah, that's fine. I don't mind. It's okay. Actually, I'm happy. I'm proud because you guys seem to be prosperous because you guys are able to actually grow more flexible food. Your diet's more interesting. You're more healthy. Your teeth are better. Next thing you know, we have the pharaoh in Egypt. And then that thing, of course, goes overboard because now it's not just about protecting the family, it's about building pyramids. And then, the farmers are kind of like, listen, this goes a little too far now. Why should I waste all my labor and energy to build a pyramid for you? What is that all about? So my point here is, again, human ingenuity, intelligence, ideas, these things drive change in the world. And the good one, definitely. Also the bad one, take Bolshevism, take Maoism. Those were ideas. They didn't just emerge from technologies. But now let me just make the last piece of this particular episode, which is I want to talk about the relevance for today. So we have Tesla investing in different states, actually. We have China, we have Mexico now, we have the US, we have Europe. And even in the US, we have Texas, we have California. So those are very different legislative environments, which is very interesting. Tesla is a very interesting case study when it comes to that. And the question is, are they all going to treat Tesla the same way or not? This is actually a very interesting case study if you think about it. So we have a dictatorship in China, we have a corrupt banana republic style, Latin American government in Mexico. Then we have an extremely democratic place in California, which is free, but has these tendencies of wokeism and almost socialist type tendencies, hijacked by the unions, hijacked by the state employees. Then we have a very Western American can-do culture in Texas. And then we have Europe in Berlin, which is, I would say, very close to the California model of socialism, social democracy, and all that stuff. So it's very interesting to see how, as the same company, the same entities will emerge in different legislators. So that to me would be a very interesting case study. And I would argue that that it's, like I said, really important to organize yourself in a proper way. And because Tesla is everywhere, they might have enough leverage to actually force a convergence of treatment. This would be my prediction. That because you are in different legislators, because the Mexicans know that you're in Texas, and the Texans know you're in California, and the Californians know you're in Berlin, and the Berliners know you're in Shanghai, there will be a convergence, that there will be a competition for the asset by all these states, because the asset's very lucrative. Because the asset itself, Tesla, is progress, creates the future, and that's something very desirable. Now it can be destroyed, but my point now, go back to Omer's paper, is that with progress comes a more lenient, a more democratic attitude of the state towards its individuals. And that's why I always said freedom drives wealth, wealth drives freedom. Why did we have a more democratic way of governing in the northern United States and the southern? Because there was more flexibility. So more flexibility, more trade, more serendipity, more ideas, more creativity, more research, more of all of that, versus sort of the old ways, land growing. That drives a more lenient way. And when the economy takes over, it's the economy stupid. That just means that when you're powerful enough, when your ideas and your progress and your wealth creation is strong enough, the state aligns itself around you. Now, unfortunately, we have a bad example actually in California, where we had that kind of development in the last 100 years, where the state became incredibly lenient towards very progressive companies. But now, unfortunately, it's flipping over. It's like bad cheese or bad milk. It's been there too long. It's been standing too long. So there's probably a sort of a halfway life. Or is that the word? The thing from nuclear physics, where you start well and then you start deteriorating. But that's a whole different conversation. I guess my point here is that I would argue that Tesla will converge the legislators towards its needs and not the other way around. I hope so, of course, as a shareholder. But those are important questions, important, interesting questions. So to summarize, we're discussing Omer Moav's paper. He wrote that with other people about the origin of the state. His argument that the change in cereal that were planted by farmers allowed people to tax them, because cereals are storable and need to be stored, and they're only once a year type crops. So and because the state was able to tax, it taxed them, and that's how the state sort of emerged. My argument would be that I disagree. I think it started with the ingenuity, with the idea of having a state, and that allowed for more flexible grains, and then also other things like animal farming, and then technology and all that stuff that came with it. You know, if you have, let's say, if you live on the River Nile and you build a water mill to irrigate your crops, you're vulnerable to attacks. I mean, you're static. As soon as you're static, you are vulnerable, and you will only do that if there is first the idea of having a state. So I would say it's not clear what the causality is, but more importantly also for today, the application for our purposes as investors in Tesla is the question, an interesting question is, Tesla is in different jurisdictions around the world. How will Tesla have different experiences, or will those jurisdictions converge around the needs of Tesla? Our prediction is that it will be the latter, because Tesla is creating enough wealth and enough surplus for all these jurisdictions to be lenient towards the company. So as long as Tesla is able to deliver surplus to customers, it's almost like Tesla has to deliver customer value and government value. So it's being tolerated and it succeeds as a company. Thank you.